Hello, this is Gary Auden, and I'm bringing you an EDUcast, IP4 Beyond Exhaustion, which may be a surprise to you. There's a real market for IP4 addresses out there. I'll be speaking today for a few minutes, and with me is Mark Lindsay, president and co-founder of a company called Ave4 LLC that deals in the market for IP4 addresses. So let's talk about what we're going to learn today. There's definitely IP4 addresses out there. There's an exhaustion, but it all depends how you look at it. We're going to move onwards and say, what does it take to move to IPv6 and why that just does not solve the problem. Move then into what's the IP4 address market. It really does exist and how it works. And then we'll look a little bit of key risks and challenges for IP4 market participation. So Mark, would you start off giving us a background of what does exhaustion actually mean?
Thank you, Gary. Yes. So IPv4, as you know, Gary, is a 32-bit addressing scheme, which really means that there are 4.3 billion unique numbers in IPv4, but of that 4.3, only 3.7 billion have been set aside for public routing. The rest are being used for engineering studies and transition to V6 for purposes of the spectrum of V4. There's 3.7 billion numbers. 3.7 billion numbers over the years since the early 90s, late 80s, the allocation period. 99.8% of that 3.7 billion has been handed out to companies, organizations, educational institutions, and even individuals. So that means, you do the math, there's about 74 million numbers still left to be allocated. That overstates the available supply even still, because all the supply is now divided up regionally. And Europe, Asia, North America, they're in a situation where they're not able to meet the demands of most organizations. So just as a factoid, the typical registration cycle has been about 176 million per year. But now we've got to the point in time where the regions APNIC, RIPE, LACNIC in particular, they're all at a point in time they only can give out a very small portion. They've reached policy exhaustion. And when they reach policy exhaustion, they say anybody that comes to the RIRs, regional registries, us, APNIC, RIPE, and LACNIC, you come to us, all you can get from us is a very small allocation. In APNIC and RIPE, that's 1,000 numbers. You get a one-time 1,000 number hit from APNIC and RIPE. After that, you're done. So
what
APNIC and RIPE.
What this actually means, though, is there's multiple organizations handing out addresses, multiple RIRs.
That's right. That's right, Gary. There are 5 RIRs. They all have a regional monopoly. In North America, Caribbean, it's ARIN. And in Europe and the Middle East, it's RIPE. In Africa, it's AFRINIC. And in the Asia-Pac region, it's APNIC. And not surprisingly, those the European market, Latin American market, the American market, and the AP market, they all had a considerable growth in the last 5 to 10 years of internet connectivity. And so they're the ones that kind of hit the exhaustion the earliest. ARIN doesn't have an exhaustion policy as such. They're going to kind of run to the end, so they'll never quite reach full exhaustion. They'll go straight to depletion.
How do we get to this point, though?
Well, so what happened is there are, prior to the existence of their RIR system, and the RIR system is kind of designed to focus on scarcely allocating IP addresses in this environment where there's not enough IP addresses going forward. Before we had this regime of RIRs, IP addresses were handed out to mostly large U.S.-based corporations and educational institutions who at the time, in the late 80s to mid-90s, thought they'd have to operate their own networks. So if you're a big company like Apple, you got 16.7 million IP addresses, even if you only needed half that. And then if you're a medium-sized organization, didn't meet the /8 qualifications, you got 65,000. So these 3 classes of IP addresses that were handed out, and because there wasn't a lot of dividing line between 65,000 and 16 million, you had a fair number of Fortune 5 U.S. companies that got large /8 inventories of 16 million numbers in the early 90s. Now, what happened when the RIRs came into existence, the ARIN region, particularly in RIPE or early in the cycle, they started applying more needs-based justification, but at that point in time, a lot of numbers had already been allocated to end users and corporations. So that big inventory supply companies thought they were going to have to operate their own network. The rise of the commercial ISP made the need for every end user on the internet to have to operate their own network. That need went away. So they no longer had to worry about addressing all their network-facing host devices and firewalls. They could rely on their, the MCIs and UNets of the world at the time to do the IP for them. So now, as their needs for unique IP addresses and users shrunk, those numbers that were still held by those companies that were given to them in the early 90s to help foster the growth of the internet, they still are holding on to those numbers even though their external-facing use of them has shrunk. Now, a lot of these companies, you can imagine over the 10 years, they allocate those numbers both internally and externally in ways that weren't designed necessarily to conserve them in that fashion. So there's a lot of use for those number spaces by those companies that hold them.
Mark, I've heard of ICANN. Where do they fit in all of this?
ICANN is the overarching organization that has a direct contract with the U.S. government. So the U.S. government, people have questions about who runs the internet, but for purposes of for the legal authority, the United States government is the steward of both number resources and domain name systems. They have entered into a contract to actually administer that governance with ICANN. So ICANN is the private organization with a government contract with NTIA under the Department of Commerce to implement policies that are meant to facilitate multi-stakeholder participation in the governance of the internet. So that's how ICANN fits into it. Underneath ICANN is an IANA function, and the IANA function is where both the number resource allocation happens. So ICANN has IANA. IANA is the organization that holds on to the free supply of IP addresses. They then hand out those IP addresses numbers to the individual RIRs, who then under their policies that are self-governed policies, they're members of each RIR, can promote policy positions, and those RIRs adopt policies, all for the purposes of deciding how to allocate the numbers they receive, each RIR receives from IANA, how those numbers are allocated to the end users, ISPs, network operators within their respective regions. And those numbers, when end users or ISPs, network operators go to the RIRs, there is a membership fee, but for all intent and purposes, they're getting those numbers for a negligible amount.
Now, Mark, one of the issues that I keep hearing about is everyone keeps saying we've got to go to IPv6 because we're running out of numbers. But in a sense, IPv6 is not just simply a simple migration. What are the issues going into moving and migrating to IPv6 and why it won't fix everything?
Well, one of the biggest drawbacks is that V6 and V4 are not compatible. So V6 is not backwards compatible to V4. So then you have to make, for all intent and purposes, V6 is a completely separate internet. Now, V6 does solve the problem of number exhaustion. There is, for purposes of how we can envision it today, there's a near infinite supply of numbers. It's 3.4 times 10 to the 38. Big number. But because of the lack of compatibility between V6 and V4, companies have to make a choice as to whether to invest in a V6 infrastructure when, in fact, the eyeballs and content in V6, that V6 internet, is still very low. If you look at any kind of traffic studies, you'll sometimes hear people talking about the increase in V6 deployments or the increase in V6 penetration. But if you start from a small number, an increase can be a big number. But in terms of aggregate traffic, it's less than approximately 6% of the content on the internet today is actually V6 enabled. So if you think about the network effects and whether any particular content provider, cloud provider, ISP ought to be investing considerably in V6, when there's very few others that they can communicate with on V6, it becomes a very difficult investment choice to make because they're still getting a lot of functionality in V4. V4 still works. There are some technical improvements together you can probably speak to as well, technical improvements with V6, theoretically, with respect to all the various different feature sets that come with it. But the real push to go to V6 is just to kind of free us up from the limitation on the V4 number supply. And that's a hard choice for many companies to make, to spend a lot of money doing something like dual stacking, which requires a replication of the V4 V6 infrastructure, tunneling is another choice, but tunneling just allows you to kind of get between two V6 endpoints using V4 or two V4 points using a V6 network, but doesn't address the fact that you actually have to have V6 eyeballs and content and interest in order for that investment to make sense.
Yeah, when I look at this, I look at the return on investment, and for a lot of people saying, am I being forced into IPv6, and what's the value to me? One of them might be that I get a lot of addresses and it can address a lot of people and help mobility, but I have to do an awful lot of investment to get into V6. Is that hindering our growth into IPv6?
It very much is, in the sense that, as long as you can continue, you've got a big investment in V4, it still works. Most people still have end-to-end V4 routers and switches and endpoints and that still work. It is definitely a hindrance in order for large companies. I represent a lot of enterprises who are thinking about moving to V6, but it's a long way off. It's a 3, 4, 5 year look forward, maybe even longer than that. And their basic view is, until the remainder of my ecosystem is also in V6, I'm not going to take my hard-earned cash and invest in that infrastructure right now, particularly when there are mechanisms for me to continue to get more out of V4. So when we talk about exhaustion, it's an important factor to note that we're talking about the depletion of the free supply of numbers. But there is still a vast amount of underutilized IPv4 addresses laying around. As we talked about, there are approximately 800 million to 1 billion numbers that have been previously allocated to companies and individuals that are not being advertised on the public internet. So now what that means is that theoretically, as much as 800 to 1 billion, almost nearly a quarter of the full spectrum of V4, could be extracted and put into higher utility if there's incentive for those who are holding on to it to put those numbers back into circulation. And in fact, a market to create that incentive has been created.
So what is that size of that market, and is it difficult to get into?
It's so it has been very difficult in the sense that there's no platform or easy mechanisms for buyers and sellers to come together, and it's also, at the moment, there is no clear way to look at the size of the trading volume or activity because there's no good public record for it. And in fact, a lot of transactions between buyers and sellers, even when you go through the process of registration, so let's spin it back a little bit. A lot of times, buyers and sellers will meet. They'll negotiate commercial terms that are all private. A buyer may then say, I want to have a public record of my acquisition of those numbers. They then must go to the RIRs, Aaron in our region, and say, can you now recognize my acquisition of these numbers? Not every transaction between buyers and sellers gets recorded into the registry record through Aaron. Some parties choose not to go the registration route to have the records updated. Some may do a transaction of greater size and then may register some portion of those numbers over time. So looking at the public records is an underestimate of the true volume. But even just looking at the North American region, in 2014, when Aaron still had a considerable amount of inventory available to give away for free, they were still allocating numbers for free, there was about 4.5 million numbers were traded and registered in the Aaron database as a transfer. This first quarter alone, Aaron still has, at the moment, just under 5 million numbers it can still give away for free through the allocation process. Even given that free supply in the first quarter of 2015, we've already seen approximately 11 million numbers traded between private parties in North America. So those numbers represent an underestimate. As I mentioned, 11 million traded in the first quarter is almost double, more than double, the free supply that Aaron currently has left in its storehouse.
Could you then talk about the market fundamentals and the rate of sale or the rate of transfer of addresses?
Yeah, so there's a lot of estimates on what really is the global or even regional consumption pattern of IP addresses, and with the efficiencies, even though there's some technical barriers, but efficiencies of carrier-grade NATs and just be more efficient about how we use public IP addresses and private IP addressing. What is the consumption rate of IP addresses? And I've gotten two models here that are based on historic patterns. And if you look at two patterns. One is, what was the consumption rate, allocation rate of IP addresses before we reached exhaustion? That was globally about 176 million numbers per year. If you look at a flow rate, and that's the flow rate about what the allocation has been in the last couple of years, when CGNs and other things, efficiencies in terms of how companies use their numbers kick in, you have a flow allocation rate of about 84 million numbers per year. Somewhere between those two numbers probably lies reality. And if you look now at this curve, just assuming nothing else happens, no other technical impediments, no meaningful changes in the availability of IP addresses, at a very high rate, you have at least another 4.5, 5 years of burning through this available supply of 800 to 1 billion previously allocated numbers before you reach the point in time when you really are no longer able to get access to freely available IPv4 addresses. And if you think about how in the last few years, more and more CGN users, there's a lot of discussion technically what the implications are for that from an innovation perspective, but looking at all the efficiencies that companies will continue to gain by using all sorts of means to use less IP address space, it's conceivable that we could be at the slow rate of allocation. So with the available supply, rate of allocation, the market, it's a good reason to believe that the market itself could allow for a continuation of V4 supply from 2019 to 2024, anywhere from 5 upwards of another 9, 10 years.
Can we take a look at the market participants then? Who's buying and selling this?
Yeah, the big buyers in the market in Europe is a little further along than it is in North America because RIPE, the European RIR, reached exhaustion earlier than did ARIN. ARIN's still not quite exhausted yet. And I think the APNIC region. So looking at those APNIC or Asia Pacific, Europe, and North America, the principal buyers have been ISPs, cloud computing providers, web hosting companies, wireless providers, and CDN providers. The telcos, oddly enough, have been participants, but they, for historic reasons, have had a very large supply of IP addresses. They're using CGNs more effectively. The likes of cloud computing providers and web hosting companies, they want static IP addresses for different reasons to serve their customers, to get carrier-independent IP addresses. So they have been early participants in the marketplace and aggressive participants in the marketplace, much more so than the telcos have. But the telcos will eventually catch up once the allocations and ARIN kind of comes to an end. Then even the telcos will start to come back to the marketplace for their long-term supply.
Don't we also have the regional and the brokers involved in this as well, the regional registries?
Yeah, the RIRs are participants and stakeholders in the process. They all the regions that have reached exhaustion have transfer policies that put constraints but facilitate the trading of numbers between buyers and sellers. They will then record that transfer of control and ownership in their registry records. Some have more market-facing policies than others. ARIN has been historically fairly conservative in its view of the marketplace, so it has imposed constraints that require a buyer of an IP address to demonstrate to ARIN that the quantity of numbers it purchases satisfy the need that particular buyer has over the next 24 months. They still impose a judgment on how much a particular buyer can acquire. A lot of the other RIRs don't apply such a strict judgment. There's also been, the new market is also, because it's arcane, it's chaotic, there's no public information available, there's a specialty that's emerged in having brokers and facilitators help buyers and sellers come together and help buyers and sellers consummate transactions. And speaking of transactions, so what is that facilitation process? What does it typically look like? There is no unified way for buyers and sellers to meet. That's why brokers come into play. They work their relationships with potential buyers and their clients, if they represent sellers or buyers. They then use their network of contacts, marketing, advertising, to reach out to counterparties. And in an ideal situation, there'll be a pre-qualification of counterparties to get them together. The parties then negotiate the terms and conditions, Most of the time, we'll talk about the transaction model, but most of the time it's in the form of an asset purchase agreement. The parties then go through a closing. After they sign the agreement, there are some closing conditions between the execution of the contract and then the actual rights and beneficial interest transfer between the parties. And the nature of those closing conditions are very customized. And then once the closing conditions are satisfied, the parties go to the closing. That's when conveyance, beneficial use, and money change the hands between the parties. As I mentioned, there are most transactions, but not all. A lot of buyers want to use the RIR databases as a means to show the rest of the world their control over the asset they've just picked up. So more times than not, registering the trades with the RIRs is the path that buyers choose to go. I mentioned Aaron has a needs process that creates some friction because buyer and seller agree, for example, to sell, exchange 524,000 numbers. Buyer then goes to Aaron and says, now I want to register 524,000 numbers. Aaron says, well, you demonstrate to me that you actually need those over the next 24 months. If they don't meet that needs test, then Aaron can sort of redefine what has been bought and sold, or at least delay the buyer's opportunity to benefit from what they purchased. So that's a friction that frequently gets negotiated in the transaction. Who bears that risk? How do you size the transaction effectively? And trying to get the right transaction put together and teed up between buyer and seller is a good part of what an effective intermediary or broker will do.
Mark, could you go then into some of the approaches that you have observed?
Yes, the typical transactional structure is going to be in the form of an asset sale. There is some question about whether V4 numbers are, legal question as to whether V4 numbers are actual property, but for purposes of the market as it exists today, buyers and sellers are all treating it as a tangible or intangible asset that gets bought and sold like equipment, software, everything else. So asset sales is the principal transactional mechanism. Some companies are interested in pursuing temporary leasing of IP address space. I say that's a smaller sliver of the market. There is some creativity in transactions. How do we get around the RIR frictions on size? Large buyers may want to get access to a large quantity of numbers that they can't necessarily have registered immediately, so they may execute a transaction, have an option to pick up more numbers over time as they can justify the need to the RIRs to consume those numbers. Creating options pricing and forward pricing curves make those very challenging and creative, but options are a way to get size up the deal when the buyer may not have the immediate ability to justify what they're looking for. M&A transactions, joint ventures, those are more novel and edge, but I have heard, I don't do it that way. I've heard of and been known about transactions where companies may be acquired and the principal asset of the acquisition is an IP address space. Those are edge cases. I think there are much more direct ways to getting at it, but there are some intermediaries and some sellers who sort of structure their transaction in that fashion. Bartering, there's a lot of opportunities to barter, particularly with large buyers and sellers. And by bartering, what I'm really driving at is you can have a transaction that might be in part cash for numbers. Let's say the purchase price for the numbers is $10 a number. You can work some portion of that off. Let's say the cash purchase price becomes $5, and there's an exchange of a good or service for the value of the other $5. So there are ways that large companies that have an existing relationship, an existing product set or service arrangement, can leverage those relationships to create value for both parties and make it less of a cash-only transaction and more of a value-enhancing transaction for buyer and seller.
But Mark, there's got to be some risk here as well.
Yeah, there are considerable risks. Again, given that this is a market that has been, it's very young, how does a buyer know that the asset it's getting is quality? How do you verify that the seller who purports to be making the numbers available has the right to do so? So digging into what, in fact, the entitlements are for the seller is a good part of what I do when I engage with my clients. I typically represent sellers. I do a lot of due diligence up front to make sure who is purporting to be the seller has the right to do so. That's not always the case, so any buyer ought to be very wary and make sure that they can do their own due diligence on verifying that those numbers, in fact, are rightfully held by the seller. There's also no mechanism for coming to price. Every deal I do, there's always a dance about, well, what is the current market price and what are the pricing parameters? Is a larger volume, is that more valuable because the aggregate space is more valuable, or is there a volume discount the bigger the transaction goes? So knowing the pricing norms is something that is more art. There's no any research paper that's reliable out there that I've read. The market insiders who do a lot of these transactions have a fairly good handle on what the fair market price ought to be, but buyers and sellers who aren't repeat players in this space have some difficulty knowing what the fair price is to close on. As I mentioned, too, the RIRs can kind of come in. If you have registration of the trades as a closing condition, a condition upon the money changing hands and the beneficial rights changing hands, if the condition of Aaron, for example, approving the registration is in your transaction, then it's possible you could have done all this work of finding buyer and seller, negotiating price, negotiating terms and conditions, and you got the size wrong, and Aaron comes in and says, nope, sorry, we're only approved 1/3 or 1/2 of that. So mitigating that risk sooner rather than later is imperative to a successful transaction.
What this brings up, Mark, though, is the whole question of who do you go for advice for this kind of thing, because it's really a very new kind of market.
No, it is very new, and the issue is that there really is no, I mean, sort of speaking against my own industry, right, there really is no barrier of entry to brokers. There's no qualifications required. There's, anybody can say they're a broker, and there are individuals who conduct themselves in different ways. I think they're very reputable, solid brokers. Right now, there's a small number of us in this space. I think the number of brokers and intermediaries will grow. They will all have different levels of experience and qualifications, so any buyer or seller who's looking for an advisor ought to be very careful in looking at the experience and reputation of your particular intermediary, because there are practices out there that are not getting a lot of daylight. There's not a lot of transparency, so you are relying a lot on the reputation and trust of who you pick. On Ave4, we founded in 2014, but all the principles of Ave4 have been advising Fortune 500 companies for at the very least 15 years each. Each of the professionals have been doing this for many years. We spun this off as a result of a practice growth of our law firm, and now we are focusing on this as a dedicated activity because there are dynamics of service delivery, market changes that are unique, and we're now focusing on this as a subject matter of Ave4's activities. And what we do at Ave4 is we principal service offerings are conducting due diligence. We'll look at all the numbers and look at the buyers, look at the sellers, and before we consummate any transaction, put two buyers and sellers together, we will do the due diligence for them. We will develop for our sellers. We represent mostly large sellers of premium blocks, legacy holders. We will develop a market strategy for them. Where are they looking, what price points are they looking for, what do they have available, what is their timeline. So we develop a very specific marketing plan for them. We do, as a general matter, we do have a very large quantity of supply. At any given time, we might have as small as a /16 block, which is 65,000 numbers, up to a /9, which is 8 million, a little over 8 million numbers. Any given time, we'll have that quantity of supply available, so we can typically meet almost any need of any buyer, given the quantity of our supply. Now, we also try to focus in on, because we do operate at the high end of the market in terms of size and buyers and sellers, we do look for opportunities to enhance the value of transactions beyond just a single closing opportunity. Some transactions will be a one-and-done cash numbers exchange. Some transactions have more complexity. We try to find opportunities to increase value for both buyers and sellers and expanding the transaction, expanding the reach of the transaction. We do structure, negotiate, and close deals. We'll do soup to nuts on a commercial basis, soup to nuts structuring of the transaction documents. And then once the transaction documents are signed, the parties go to closing, we will help typically our clients, who are the sellers, we will help them go through the registration process to transfer the registration of the numbers they've sold to a buyer. So we think about our services being sort of a complete set of services delivered by experts who've been doing this since well before the market emerged in 2011. We were insiders advising pre-market participants, if you will, on the nature of the assets, the nature of the market. And as a result of that long-term experience, we developed this robust product offering to try to make the market a little bit more transparent, mitigate risks for all involved. And although we do represent sellers, a lot of the buyers like working with us because of the fact that we do put our reputation forward and expose that to make sure that the right deals get closed, not just any deal gets closed.
Thank you very much, Mark. And what I'd like to point out to those of our viewers, there are several documents that are available. The first one, obviously, is going to the Ave4 website. But there's been a lot of discussion about moving to IPv6, what happens to IPv4, what the organization is going to be dealing with, the politics and economics, which I know you've dealt with an awful lot. And I'd like to introduce one other person to those of your viewers, your partner, Janine Goodman, both of whom are very experienced in this field. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you, Gary.